Usually when people think about cybersecurity incidents, they think about the technical aspects. They think about the people in, I don't know, trench coats and sunglasses, thinking they're doing cool things on keyboards. All of that's also wrong. Although I would say Dustin and I have met a few of those too. What
Yeah.
people usually don't think about and can be much more impactful is the legal aspects of a cybersecurity incident. Welcome to welcome to Legitimate Cybersecurity. My name is Frank Downs. I'm here with Dr. Dustin Brewer as always, and today we have a very special guest. We have Kate Hanniford, a cybersecurity and data privacy partner at Alston Bird. She's one of the most impressive legal minds I've ever experienced in cybersecurity, and I'm really glad you're here, Kate. Thank you so much. I think when people think about cybersecurity, so often they think about the technical aspects, the keyboards, the mice. They think about crazy, kind of montage with the digital music in the background, like do 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 do. But what I've learned in this career and in this field so far is legal has a huge aspect to it. So I'm really excited. I'm glad you could be here. Thank you for coming.
Thanks so much for having me, Frank. I appreciate it. It's always great to be here.
Awesome. So first and foremost, one of the things that we want to get out of the way up front, these are all your personal views, right? This is all your personal take and everything along those lines. So thank you so much for sharing them. But I am actually very curious. And one of the things we like to talk about when we start these discussions are how people kind of get in the position where they are, right? Because when people think about cyber, like I said, they don't always think about, the legal aspects, but the legal aspect is arguably more powerful than anything else at the end of the day, because the law is rather, well, I would say the law is rather immutable, but I guess we could have a discussion about also later. The law is the law. What made you get interested in cybersecurity? How did you find yourself here? And when you were 5 and you realized this is what you wanted to do, how did you plan that all out?
Happy to talk about that. And I'm here, only in my personal capacity. Want to share, happy to share my views and discuss a lot of interesting things. But really only, only in that personal capacity. And I would say that, information's accurate as of today, March 6th as well.
Yeah.
And when I was 5, I don't think this existed. So I didn't
Right.
know that I wanted to be a cyber lawyer all the way back then. But it is funny that I think when you trace back and you look at your life, at kind of the arc of your different interests over time, classes that I thought were interesting, that it does meld a lot of different interests that seem kind of disparate or random or maybe not particularly connected, but actually does link up, a lot of interests and then I think a lot of strengths. So I started off doing actually financial institutions work and SEC enforcement and compliance at a firm. This will date me, but I came of age during the global financial crisis. So I graduated law school in 2009 and honestly was just really happy to have a good job.
Hey, if that dates you, it dates us too. So it's okay. You're in great company.
So I took a national security law class in law school and I thought it was fantastic. But it wasn't immediately apparent how that was going to be relevant to, actually practicing as a lawyer for me personally. But I think what I eventually kind of came to see through working through a variety of different cases, one of which was at the time, one of the largest US bank failures in history. Another had to do with high-speed algorithmic trading, co-location of servers, right? Another having to do with the back-end guts of settlement and clearance systems. So a lot of these were like heavily data-driven, high-speed data flow issues that all
Yes.
intersected with various different legal frameworks, which was why I was in the room. But eventually kind of came to see that what I was really enjoying about these cases was the data component. It was less about, the market manipulation allegations or some of the other allegations that brought these other matters into the enforcement and the litigation context. And then I think, before I went to law school, I did political campaign work. And so I was already used to kind of fast paced 24-hour type of work and the kind of crisis management component that goes with it. And so all of these things kind of quickly started to kind of combine and coalesce. And I was just
Mhm.
really lucky to take some calculated risks when some opportunities came my way and to get in maybe not at the ground floor, because I think maybe that was probably you. I think that's probably Frank and Dustin here. But a pretty, pretty early on, in terms of when, companies and clients started figuring out that they needed somebody, like me who could help them with these types of issues.
I really like that. I think that's really interesting that I wanted to first give you kind of a heads up that you kind of did get in at the ground level too. Dustin and I have had more than one discussion about when cybersecurity really became a thing. And you're kind of hitting that era right there. I mean, cybersecurity has always been around. Information security has always been around. But when it really kind of came into its own, I'd say was in between the '08 and 12 era, where, cyber command started coming online, things like a real focus started to come onto it. And I think it really hit its stride when, the CEO of Target got fired because cybersecurity went wrong, kind of thing. So
Mhm.
what's interesting there is I find it unique. And this is me being completely ignorant, by the way. When you hear about doctors, for example, they have to know in like med school and whatnot, what part of the body they want to specialize in, right? Like you got neurosurgeons, you got cardiac surgeons, you got whatever the dudes that like feet are, right? Stuff like that. But were you the way it sounds like you were able to go through law school and you could still kind of have a wide field that you could pick from? Is that kind of like how it works with lawyers here?
Yes. I mean, I think that is changing. So now you could take a data privacy class, you could take a cybersecurity law class, and I think AI is changing all of that as well in terms of that as a whole nother field that's really bridging, privacy and cyber, which are, oftentimes two sides of the same coin, right? You need to understand all of that to be effective, in this day and age. Law school it's 3 years. Usually it's got a pretty lockstep type of curriculum. So everybody takes the same courses the first year, and then you can start to choose a path more your second year and your third year. And oftentimes the bigger decision is you want to be in litigation or in transaction. And again, cybersecurity kind of sits at the intersection of that. My view of how I approach my practice is really directly informed by the fact that I started out as a litigator. I started out
Mhm.
defending companies that were in adversarial proceedings or investigations, where they had regulatory enforcement risk, where they had third party litigation. And I think a lot of that informs the
Yeah.
risks that I see associated with cybersecurity incidents and proactive cybersecurity, because this is a lot at its core risk management. Now, it's also true that you have to understand
Yeah.
contracts, right? You've got to understand contracting parties, legal obligations, and how those work between business partners, not just among, um, companies that are regulated by government entities or duties owed to your consumers. So, I think you've got to have an appreciation for both of them. But it has long been the case that law students will often say, "I want to be a litigator," or "I want to do, transactional work," and that's the big divide. And then within those different areas, people will specialize in different areas. So you really can go through law school, eating, you know, diversely from the buffet.
Right.
But when you start interviewing for jobs, which happens earlier and earlier now we interview people, in their first year. The question is going to be, what do you think you want to do? And that's really it. It's what do you think right now that you want to do in a couple of years' time? It's not actually exacting a blood oath of like, and now you're going to do this. And of course, no one is ever going to care about your career as much as you do. And so it really is about, being in the driver's seat and being able to say, well, these are the issues that I'm interested in. Here's how I can be most effective. Here are the types of things I like to work on. Here are the types of people I want to work with. And you kind of fit all these pieces together, I think, in a way that then eventually, hopefully, turns into an interesting and rewarding and purposeful, professional life.
I, I love it. I think it's great. Well, first of all, I'm a fan of buffets. So I like your example right
I
there,
mean,
especially diverse ones, because then I always get to try all the different ones. But I think that's pretty fantastic. Now, I want to drill a little bit down into the role a bit. You get a very unique perspective that Dustin and I see a lot. You get that phone call when the CEO, the CISO, right, are like, okay, this is actually a problem, right? Like you deal with companies arguably at their worst moment right after a breach. Is there any commonality, like, on that first discussion when they reach out to you? Like, is there a similar vibe? Like, what's that phone call like when they reach out to you or that email like, that first meeting? Do you see any consistencies? Anything that, like, is shared by everyone? How is that?
Sure. I mean, first, you hope that that's not the first time you're actually meeting the CISO or the general counsel or the
Ideally.
CEO, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which isn't always the case. Sometimes you are. Sometimes it is a true 911 call and they say, I've got an issue. So and so suggested I give you a call. Can you help me? Oftentimes, though, it's someone who you've worked with, or, ideally, it's someone who we've, put their incident response plan together and tested it with them and it's been on the shelf and now all of a sudden they need it, right? But ideally, you kind of know the people in your neighborhood. Um, what is, I think, increasingly the case is I am increasingly impressed with the level of kind of overall risk awareness, the level of concern and kind of awareness that executives have, both in terms of board risk, and in terms of needing to like update their board, keep them informed, and then also the operational risks, the business risks, reputational risks, all of these different risks that are kind of swirling around in their head at a time where they know practically nothing about what's actually happening. And I
Yeah.
think that's, one of the hardest pieces, I think, of what we do is to try to figure out, what do we know? How do we make the best decisions that we can in the short term, understanding we're going to live in the gray? And then what do we think is going to be knowable? Where do we define, kind of the level of certainty that we are going to be able to get comfortable with, versus, knowing that we're probably just never going to have the answers to some of these questions. And those can be really hard. I think particularly, oftentimes CEOs are very detail oriented people. They're data driven, which can be very helpful. But they usually have strategic vision, and they've got usually a pretty clear ranking of priorities. And so a lot of time, what I spend my time doing is kind of translating that with what the legal obligations are and what we're hearing from the security team, because all of that needs to work together, and there needs to be a lot of information flow in both directions or in all directions to make sure that everybody can, that I'm there to support like the best decision making that can happen. My job is not actually to decide, but it is to help make sure that everybody has the best understanding of the risks that they are facing, the options or choices that they have to make, and how to get there, in as constructive a way as possible. Um, I think a common misconception when you call, breach counselor, you've got outside legal end, right? It's never a good day. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that like
Yeah.
anytime that I am on the phone after hours because of a data incident, it's a bad day for some people. And I think one of my main jobs is to reassure the security team, which usually by the time I get called, they have been working around the clock, and they're tired, and they don't have a handle on something that they really wanted to have a handle on. And so one of the first things that I try to do is reassure them that I am not the circular firing squad, and I am not here to start assigning blame and trying to figure out like who is responsible for what, but it's actually to just help everybody get ourselves out of this together and in one piece, and in a way that makes a lot of strategic sense for the client.
So, and being in this role, like how deep do you usually like have to get technically into it? Because it seems like this can get really technical really
Mhm.
quickly, especially when we're talking about breaches and everyone wants to know attribution is one of those things that sometimes people want to know, and like how this happened, and like so where does that kind of demarcation happen with your role usually? And I know it probably changes
I
from
think
case to
it's
case,
very
but
important to have a deep technical understanding of what the system architecture is, the environment, the types of operating systems, how many endpoints, what type of software is being used, and the different
yes.
security controls that are in place to try to that are intended to be protecting that. And it's something that my team is constantly focusing on, and it's constantly changing. So we're constantly looking and seeing what are the CVEs that have come out, what are the vulnerabilities that are
Yeah.
being exploited? Like, what are the threat actor groups that we see in the industries where our clients are? So it's something that you have to stay on top of continuously. It's also one of, I think, the most exciting and fun things about this practice is that you're always learning. And it's very satisfying when you can go and say, oh, yes, like this, this is a signature move of this threat actor. Have you searched for these three different file extensions on your system? Those are ISCs that may help you have a more efficient investigation, right? Because the goal is to do this as efficiently, as possible. And so I think, there's a lot of creative problem solving that I think comes from that. I'll also say that the more technical expertise that I can bring, the better I can supervise the forensic investigation. And the more creatively we can think about problem solving in terms of, well, we don't have this artifact. Okay, you don't have this logging, but maybe you have shell bags over here. What kind of circumstantial evidence can we bring that will help us round out a picture of what actually happened? And that usually the deeper and the harder that we press on the forensic investigation in terms of what artifacts are available, the more favorable conclusions we can reach for the client. Because it allows us to craft the more complete story, and it allows us to kind of figure out where we are with a level of certainty that is going to support the legal conclusions that's going to drive the client's overall strategy for response. So
And
I think the technical piece is actually really, really important.
And I think it puts you in a unique spot too, because you have to be aware of not just the technical, you have to have a certain level of technical understanding at this point, but you also have to a certain level of regulatory understanding too, because there's a lot of regulators out there that a lot of people aren't thinking about or wish they didn't have to think about. Which
Yeah.
also brings me to my next question. When you're working with, because you have to work with these regulators a lot when they visit the companies. Is there like are there certain regulators that people are most afraid of, that companies are most afraid of? Like, are they more afraid of, say, after an incident, the SEC showing up, or maybe FTC, or maybe the AG, or like, is there a certain like boogeyman out there that most people share?
I don't know that there's a common a common boogeyman, but I think there is a healthy level of concern about providing accurate information to a primary regulator, and particularly what's your primary regulator. And I think the U.S. regulatory framework is very inefficient. Is my just from my own personal view. I would still have plenty to do
Written by a lot of different people with
if
different
we had
ideas. Yeah.
if we had more rational, a more rational and unified approach to this. But most of my clients, because I do a lot of work in the financial services and in the healthcare space, and so there's a lot of different regulatory and overlapping jurisdictions there. Um, and so I think there are certain regulators that tend to be more aggressive, but it also varies by state, and it's also informed by different economic trends. So, for example, we have seen, an uptick in oversight and cases brought by the Texas AG, which a lot of people think are tied to the movement from California to Texas of major tech firms and
Oh.
private equity activity, right? So it's not something that you would necessarily think about. Certain AGs also have certain issues that they just care very deeply about. And it becomes an area of keen focus. And you can see that across, the whole panoply of different regulators. They're also inherently, in some cases, political beasts. The SEC changes with the political administrations. It changes leadership. It has shifting priorities. And so that is something that we expect, of course, at the federal level. We saw in the first Trump administration, how federal regulation really was pulled back and the states moved in. So the state AGs and the state financial regulators moved in to fill that gap and then never really stepped back during the Biden administration and now have continued that path. So I think, one of the things that it's important to me when I'm counseling a client is to think about what are the regulatory relationships that are really important to you? And what is your strategic plan for growth or expansion? And you need to have an understanding of where those regulatory risks lie. If there are existing examinations, investigations, if there are consent orders, right? There are all these different collateral consequences that can kind of be in the background initially, but actually become very important when you're trying to devise a strategy for managing through an incident and those various different risks. And I think, on balance, the regulators that I have interacted with have all been, almost to a T, incredibly conscientious and not
Mhm.
abusive. They're trying to fulfill their own regulatory mandates, right? Which is to
Sure.
make
Yeah.
sure that these companies are doing what they're supposed to be doing and complying with the regulations. And we see how hard it is for them to do that. If you look at um, some of the actions that have been brought that center on what is reasonable security. It's actually pretty hard for regulators to say and to prove that something was in fact not reasonable security. Like if you have like an enterprise-wide tool that's deployed throughout an enterprise, but you have one misconfiguration. Does that mean that the whole thing is in fact not reasonable?
Yeah,
I would happily defend that case,
but where
right?
is
It's
that
much
line?
easier.
Where is that line? Like, where is that line between bad luck and negligence and whatnot? Like, do you see any commonalities there, or is that not really established?
I mean, it depends, right? I think, the general rule of thumb is that you want to flag risks. You want to identify risks and then figure out how you're going to handle them. And sometimes you have to accept the risks in a short term or you put compensating controls in place. Other times you were like, we've got this handled. We have a best in class tool and we feel great about it. But there are tremendous budget constraints and you can't spend all of your money on cybersecurity. It's just not realistic. And so then the process really becomes like what are your risks and how are you managing them and to do that in a way that is reasonable and defensible and that will really set you up for success. The easier cases you can see state AGs starting to build cases in a more savvy way, like show me the oldest date of the data that was exfiltrated by the ransomware threat actor? What is
Oh,
the oldest file that was exfiltrated? Great, thank you. Please send me a copy of your data retention policy and schedule,
Ooh,
right?
yeah.
It's
no.
much
Oh,
easier
no.
to say. But that's a much easier case to work up, right? You don't have to argue about like this, improperly configured MFA, or a network facing server that was just misconfigured, or whether or not a patch was timely applied within the first 24 hours according to
Mhm.
manufacturer spec and then validated, right? You just say, look, you had data longer than you were supposed to have it,
Yeah.
and you know you
My
had it
gosh,
longer than
there's
you were supposed
so
to have it,
I can
right?
this
That's
gotta
an
be it's
easier
gotta
case.
maybe be one of the easiest things to ask.
So,
So
but you can see, but you and I both know how challenging data retention and data disposition is because we generate so much data and it's become so cheap to keep data. And most people want to hold on to data for a variety of different psychological reasons as well, and least of which being like you're proud of the work that you've done or you think you need it later. So you have these kind of competing tensions there. And you can see the state as here was those state AGs, right? But you can see the state AGs, the FTC, all of these different regulators, you can see them becoming more and more sophisticated in terms of their own technical knowledge and their ability to put these cases together. So, unfortunately, there is, the goalposts continue to move, and we've long known that with cybersecurity, right? Because our tools are getting better, we can do more, but that also means that more is expected.
oh, yeah. Sorry. It is a lot because that is a great example of one that always scares me, right? Because data classification, data retention, the amount of times I've seen people who are like, "No, I'm gonna need that for later." I'm like, "This is over 10 years old." "No, I might need that." It's like, do you want this discoverable? Like it's a mentality, right? Because I think my perspective is it's also healthy to get rid of data after a certain time because data can be your best friend. Data can be a loaded gun. It's all about the context in which the data can sit or is needed. So, um,
Well, there's
when
there's important preservation obligations there too. Oftentimes, it is a little bit like an out of body experience for some people to hear a lawyer talking about secure destruction of data. But there
Yeah.
are, oftentimes where you should be destroying the data, and there are also other times where you need to be preserving it. So it's just one of those you need to ask.
yeah, so okay, um, on that topic, and I promise this may be my last regulatory question. But there's the SEC's 4-day disclosure rule, breach disclosure rule. What has your experience been with breach disclosures? Because 4 days seems kind of like both seems like a long time to me, but also it can seem like a very short time as well. And I'll give you like an example here. Figuring out when something really is an incident, that can take a day or two sometimes. Not because you want it to take a day or two, but like, is it normal? What are the tools available? Stuff like that. And then making sure you can appropriately disclose the right amount of information regarding the breach without over disclosing. Like you don't have to give specific examples, but like vibes wise, like how does everyone feel? What have you seen as far as like everyone just had to deal with a disclosure, a 4-day disclosure?
Yeah, I think let's keep it at the 30,000 vibe level.
Yeah.
One is so importantly, it's 4 days to file the 8K from the date that you determine that it's a material cybersecurity incident, right? So it's not 4 days from like when the incident happened. But what it does kick off is a an exercise that you have to go through periodically to say, what do we think, what do we think about this? And ideally you have a list of kind of considerations of things that would weigh in favor, for, or against a materiality determination. And so you have to go through this process. There's surprising, the lawyers like a process, but there should be a process in place, right? Where you consider these are the things that we would generally consider or push, towards materiality or away from materiality, and where are we here? And you have to do that and do that on a periodic basis and reassess it, right? So just because you have an incident, you're like not material, doesn't mean you're done with that. If there are facts that come to light, if there are facts that change, your understanding evolves, the incident gets worse, you got to reassess it. Now, the 4-day period I think is really important though, because if you want to try to get a national security or public safety exception, the FBI has a really tight timeline where it also needs that time to run the traps on its end. And I think that was one of the biggest changes with that rule is because it did upend what had been a much more informal practice in working with AUSAs to get a law enforcement delay if there was a need, which was oftentimes a much more kind of broadly defined set of circumstances in terms of
Hmm.
things that would assist law enforcement, support public safety, and of course, national security. But many times there are active and ongoing law enforcement investigations that are kind of wrapped up in or around some of these other cyber incidents. And so this is a much more narrow set of circumstances where you can get that delay. Now, the other side of the coin is that delayed filing is just a delay. It doesn't actually excuse notice. And so the other side is if you're thinking about your company and you've got what you think is a material incident and you're going to need to make a disclosure, do you want to go ahead and just rip the Band-Aid off and make the disclosure on time? Or do you want to get a delay knowing that you're going to have to disclose it later, and people will be able to do the math and say the incident was discovered on this date, T plus 4, even though it's about, you've got some wiggle room there.
Yeah.
If you're more than 30 days out and you're making this disclosure, like, wow, this must be really juicy
Yeah.
because you seem to have gotten a delay.
Yeah.
So I think it can sometimes cut against you in that regard. Now, I guess the one other gloss I would put on this is the SEC recently, this was last year, put out guidance which said, hey, all you guys are putting out 8Ks under the material number, but you're all saying that you're just doing this and it's not really material. So like knock it off. Because they're two other items that
They're
you
just
can do.
making reports for what? For fun?
Well, there are two other items that you can file under to report what is basically a non-material cybersecurity incident. If you wanted to, this new number is really, you're supposed to only file under that number if you have a material cybersecurity incident, but people are afraid of being wrong. They're afraid of that hindsight bias. As the SEC comes in with 2020 hindsight bias, they're afraid of plaintiff's risks, right? So they're inclined in some cases to go ahead and file under that number to say like, hey, we tried to comply. We're not really sure, but we're doing best effort because we want to be good corporate citizens, even if we think, it's probably not material. So it has led to, I think, it's an open question whether or not that rule has actually led to better disclosures about cyber incidents, whether the market even cares. But it's there and people are providing it. I think the other thing to think in mind or to keep in mind is that once you make that, you have a general obligation to update it. So you have to keep that fresh, which means there comes other points where you're going to, the question is then, do we need to make a supplemental filing? What is that supplemental filing going to say? So it becomes a series of kind of considerations that you kind of, acquire once you make that initial filing.
I do have one more regulation question myself, if it's okay, Kate. I actually want your opinion on this. It's getting better, but it seems like some of the regulations and laws that have been around for a while are somewhat outdated in their verbiage, right? So, like, I can specifically talk about HIPAA here, and if like you go through and you read Security Rule 45 or even Privacy Rule 45, it's kind of like cool, but like there's probably a little bit more, and I get why maybe in legalese you wouldn't want to be as prescriptive, but I also feel like, and I get that that's intentional to an extent, but it also feels like they could be maybe a little bit more prescriptive because, as we talked about earlier, things are up for interpretation sometimes. But what's your take on that? Like, do you kind of see? I do kind of see this getting better, but do you see this getting better as far as the writing that goes into some of these laws and regulations?
There's real tension there because I think they're kind of two poles. One is we're going to write rules of that or laws that are really loosely, broadly worded, and then
Hmm.
we're going to decide which particular standards we will treat as fulfilling those rules to give ourselves flexibility because the technology is changing fast, because the tooling is changing so fast, right?
Hmm.
And then the other one is, you know what? We don't actually trust the entities that we regulate all that much, and we are going to mandate certain baseline standards with a level of precision so that there is no chance that there is going to be any miscommunication about what the baseline levels of standards are for everyone. But what's interesting is that there is, I think, a very wide adoption there for reasonable security laws, whether they're promulgated by federal or state bodies, is this notion of a risk assessment. That there has to be some type of homework that the entity does to say, what are we really worried about? What are our biggest risks? And let's tailor it to us. And that part is still very important because I also think that sliding scale of risk, of size, that is very important that entities be able to tailor that to what is actually appropriate to them, because you cannot have one size fits all. That we know that that is going to be both over inclusive and uninclusive and not work.
Yes.
But there are certain basic controls where I they are so helpful, and so important, that we know everyone either has them deployed or is striving to deploy them across the enterprise. And those are the tools that you see, when you have incidents in recently there's been a lot of M&A activity recently, right? And so, integration is always a challenge, and that's where you see, like, gosh, we had that deployed to 98% of our environment, but it was this one account, we hadn't gotten to yet, for example. And that's where I think you see those challenges there, because there is, these environments are constantly in flux, right? They are always changing.
Yes.
And I think that is where you've got to, realistically, to have kind of like a rational regulatory framework, it has to be something that can account for that pace of business. And the counterexample of that is, look at what's happening in Europe with the AI Act, which is
Yeah.
so if you read the AI Act, you're like, yeah, that's the kind of world I want to live in. Like, that's actually, those are, those are some great protections, or wouldn't that be nice from a privacy perspective and all this? But it has stymied technological innovation, and people don't really know how to implement it or how to comply with it. And so it has generated a tremendous amount of head scratching and inefficiencies and cost. And the one thing that we have, I think, as in terms of the U.S. Regulatory framework and the U.S. economy, is that we don't seem to be willing to impose that level of heightened regulatory requirements on these industries, even if they're highly regulated. I will say, to argue the other side of this, is if our financial services, the financial sector has figured out how to move a lot of data very quickly and very securely.
Yeah.
And that is an area where I think there is some growth to be done, writ large, in the healthcare sector, right? Which also has a lot of data. But if you start to look at, like, all of those different data flows, you figure out how, like, it's immediately apparent how very complicated they are, and why we have these different pain points. And so I think it's just something that's going to take some time to
Yeah.
sort out. But I think technologically, there should be some tooling that's going to help us kind of grow with those leaps and bounds so that it becomes more secure.
And one quick follow up to that, and this is kind of just kind of an adjacent, or maybe a tangent here that I'm going to go off on. Anecdotally, in your
Hmm.
opinion, is there, like, when you're jumping into, help an organization or whatever, or to try to help, figure out what's going on with a particular incident, or whatever it may be, when you sit down with an organization and you sit down and you're like, okay, what kind of frameworks or standards are you guys using? Is there one particular that stands out to you that you're like, oh, these guys are going to be good? Or, and I get this is very opinion based, but, do you kind of see anything flow towards, if someone's like, yeah, we follow, NIST 853, or we do this, you're like, okay, these guys are going to be good. Like, we're probably not going to find too much here, or need to do too much, digging.
No.
Okay.
I think,
No, that's a
like,
fair
just,
answer.
I
That's a
mean,
fair answer.
it's really like how much you do, because people are like, well, look, we're a NIST shop. I'm like, well, that's great, because it means you know what NIST is and you're striving towards something. But, like, when was the last time you actually went through the exercise to see, like, where you actually are
Yeah.
on that NIST
Is
maturity
in
framework? Like,
compliance.
where
Yeah.
are you in their
Yeah.
maturity framework?
Okay.
Like, what
No,
are
that's
you
great.
actually doing? Right.
Yep.
And like, is that good enough to, like, keep up with the Joneses? Or, I mean, I think, when people are like, well, look, we gave you our SOC 2. What more do you want? I mean, if you're on, the other side, and I'm like, "See, look, okay, thank you. We should just
Well,
have a screen. Can I just save that as an animated GIF, and I can, like, just send that back an email?"
yeah.
People are like, well, look, I gave you a SOC 2. We should check the box now. And you're like, no, that's not how this works, right? And ISO certification is rigorous, right? It requires a lot to maintain an ISO certification, right? That's always a good sign. But you always have to kick the tires, right? Because
Yes.
all of those are in some ways kind of like a snapshot in time.
Of
And
course.
I
Yeah.
think, there's I think, NIST is, I think, continues to be a standard bearer, because that's also what the federal government uses, right? So everybody who's examining you from the federal government is just by default more familiar with that. But there isn't one. I mean, I think, like, the SANS or the CIS top 20 controls, I think those are tremendously useful. But it is, again, all about, like, how you look at them and assess them from your own environment. I had a client recently say like, well, just give me the five controls that I need to deploy. Like, well, I mean, I can give you my preferred, like, Kate's
Yeah.
favorite,
Would that we could, right?
but I'm like, how you do this, what you're doing with it. And, and by the way, if you do this and then like these alerts and logs don't go anywhere and no one's looking at them, like
Yeah.
they're no good at all, right? A lot of
Right.
that is like, who is actually going to be looking at this? How quickly are they responding? And is it tuned properly? Do you know what to do with it? So there is no, I think part of what's interesting, but also part of what is super frustrating for my clients a lot of time is that there's no like quick fix. It
Right.
is a hard process
Yes.
and we have great tools, but you also need great people. And it just
Hmm.
requires this is why we call it a team sport, right? It just
Like
requires a lot
I,
of teamwork.
I like that a lot. And speaking of great tools, something you brought up earlier was you mentioned AI, and it wouldn't be an episode of this show if we didn't talk about it at least once. Do you think with the adoption, with by and large what you're seeing, are companies creating more legal risk by rapidly adopting AI? I mean, because I feel like everyone and their cousins like, yeah, bring it in, bring it in, bring it in. Or I also see people who are like, yeah, we use it, and they have all these subscriptions that are never touched, right? So, like, what kind of legal risk are you seeing? Just in general in the industry as you're going about your day, are they just creating more problems for themselves, or do you think they're handling it appropriately?
It feels a little like a bunny hop at the moment. A couple hops forward, a couple stop back. You're not really sure. Um, I think sometimes it's a little too early to tell, right? Because I think companies are also struggling with like, what are my KPIs for this, right? Because it's expensive. And so part of that is like, how do we set this up when, the dream, right? The engagements that are always great when they come in are the ones that are saying, hey, we're thinking about this, help us set this up from the get-go, right? So you can build in a really thoughtful and strategic way. So you prevent the scenario where you're gonna have to like rip a bunch of stuff out after, later on because it wasn't compliant, or you find like, this one business line has, gone ahead, bought some licenses, and now has like created some agents and turned them loose in the system. And you have to figure out like what they're doing and is it okay,
Yes.
right? Second example is like that's the costlier one because you have to figure out what's happening, adjust it, and then like play catch up. So I do think that there's a lot of really great use cases out there. But it also has to be with really widely understood guardrails. So AI tends is an accelerator, right? We all know that. It also accelerates like compliance risk and legal risk and all of these things. And so for clients that have or companies that have a really good existing risk management framework, they're able to adopt AI in a way that is much, much easier with much less kind of heartburn than those that had significant gaps or really siloed different organizational kind of like
Because they
responsibilities
had the
where they're
RMF up
having
front.
to like
Yeah.
come together a lot more quickly and make a lot more decisions with a lot more time pressure, frankly.
Yeah.
And that has been much more challenging, I think, to work through. But I remain ultimately very optimistic about AI and what it will be able to do for all of us. In terms of help, we will get to think about more interesting questions. We will be able to do more. We're going to do less of the stuff that we don't
Yes.
want to do, more of the things that we do want to do. I mean, you can see this now even in just like the enhanced EDR tooling that is AI enabled in terms of it's making SOCs more efficient and, in terms of
I've heard
eliminating
about them.
the
Dustin and I might have seen one or two.
yeah. So, I mean, like the if you can eliminate some of the noise for your team, that's actually really great.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
particularly when you have agents that can say, well, not only did we detect this, but then we like isolated it, and when they can start taking actions themselves to neutralize threats in your environment, that's really great. You also want to be sure that like there's a human who's authorized who can kill it, right? And I
Yes.
think who can kill it, who can unwind it, who can tweak it, right? How do you do you have an audit trail so you can see everything that it did? So if it does, go on the fritz, you can try to like figure out what you need to go fix. So,
Hmm.
all of those things we can solve for that. Um, but it just takes some intentionality and it does take work. And so I think this notion that now we'll hit some buttons and sit back is of course not accurate, right?
Right.
It's just a
We
different
agree.
challenge.
Now, wait, Dustin, do you have any more questions? Because I have some very special questions before we end things up. We're coming up on time.
I want to hear the special questions. Let's do it.
Okay. Well, Kate, you have inspired my daughter, who has wanted to be a lawyer ever since she could talk. And I asked, why do you want to be a lawyer? She goes, because you get to yell. And I said, fair enough. And she has a few questions that she'd like me to ask.
It's a
So we'll do
hardball.
a
I'm
quick,
ready.
quick, quick question round, if you will, with these lovely little questions. First, are you allowed to yell a lot?
It is generally frowned upon because we like to treat people with respect. So here's the thing. I did when I was in law school and I was trying to decide whether to be a litigator or a transactional lawyer, and I talked with someone who was a litigator and I was like, "How do you like do you have to fight all day? Like that sounds kind of exhausting to me." And he was like, "No, just don't be a jerk." And he used more colorful language, but he was like, like you just decide not to be a jerk because everybody needs to work together with one another and to work well. And so like I'm not going to be a jerk to opposing counsel, and I'm not going to be a jerk to my associates or my partners or anyone else. And so there are times where I wouldn't call it yelling, but I would say that you may modulate your tone of voice to speak with a little bit more authority or force, but it's not actually yelling. And so sometimes you need to like come with the ground you stand on in that regard. But generally, yelling is not the way to win any arguments or persuade people, because what we would rather do is persuade.
Yeah. Well, and now Frank's daughter is not going to want to become a lawyer anymore because she
I
can't
know.
yell.
Uh,
So,
I mean, she can't
which
yell.
maybe.
are you allowed to decorate your room?
Yes, you
Oh,
are allowed to
lovely.
decorate your room.
This is the one I'm very excited about. Can you make your own words?
That's a good question. So I think some lawyers do make their own words. I
Really?
recently heard, yes, but it's actually kind of a bugaboo because I'm a little bit of a stickler for like grammar and word usage, and not surprisingly, but there's like, I recently heard someone talk about like actionizing something, and they're like, and I'm going to action this item, or we've started actionizing that. I'm like, I think you just mean it's like already in there. We're
Yeah.
going to start working on that. We're going to act on, like, act is actually what you want to say. You don't need to action. Action is not a verb, and actionizing is, I don't know what that is. But so it's like when people say like, well, we were utilizing, I'm like, you were just using it. So oftentimes the simple is better. I will say though that the group that does get to invent worse is oftentimes the security, technical, or the software development team, because they're actually creating things. They are making things. And if you make things, then you get to name them. And lawyers tend not to make things. But we do think about things and analyze them, and we identify patterns, and sometimes we can assign colorful names. The one thing I do get to do sometimes is I get to assign colorful project secret names to
Awesome.
projects.
Love it.
So that's you could have that kind of fun.
Which kind of answers the next question and her last question before I've got one. Are you allowed to color and play music in your office?
Yes, I don't think it is not permitted. It's actually a good question.
You'll have to do an experiment, maybe
I
a
mean,
little
I think
coloring and music later
I
today.
can do some coloring and some music play. So there are some people who doodle while they are on calls instead of taking notes, or they kind of take notes and doodle at the same time. I do have colored pens and highlighters, so I have coloring
She takes mine all the
implements.
time, so here we go.
I think that ticks the box. And then I think, you've got your iPhone has iTunes or whatever it is, right? So
There you go.
I think you can listen to music as long as it doesn't bother any of your colleagues. But I will also say I was very heartened to see a Washington Post article this morning that talked about an airline that is going to kick people off the plane if they don't use headphones for their video content.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
For people
And
who do
they've
that.
added it to their carrier. Yeah, they've
Savages.
added it to their carrier license, right? So it's like when you buy a ticket, you get the license, you agree by the carrier rules, and it's basically like if you play your content loudly, we can like take measures, including kicking you off the plane. Which
Listen, I've
I
never
think
had that, and I fly Spirit. So,
I
like,
feel like that is a return to civility
yeah,
in some ways
I'll
because
Yeah.
take it.
Agreed.
nobody wants to hear that,
Well, in
So
Turkey, it's illegal to get up before it's your turn to get off the plane because they don't like the clogging. Yeah. You cannot, in Turkey, they passed a law that you can get arrested where if once they land, you do the whole thing where you see in the States here, everyone gets up and is like, oh, nope, straight to jail. Straight to jail.
I
Straight
mean,
to
I hope
jail.
that it would be nice if we could just have some agreement on that before we get to criminal penalties. Like, I feel like that,
Sure. Yeah.
and that's kind of how I
Yeah.
feel about like maybe we could just agree to like put our headphones on if we're going to listen to sounds and not have to threaten to kick people off of the plane. But I also think that flight attendants are incredibly hardworking and probably deserve to be
Oh, yeah.
treated a lot better.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So anything that's going to like make people listen to them, I'm good for that too.
And my last question that we have started to ask pretty much all our guests. If you had one piece of advice, doesn't have to be legal, one piece of advice in your whole life experience that you've had, that if someone came by and said, give me the one piece of advice you think is most impactful for you, what would it be?
I feel a lot better about myself and the world around me when I help people. And I think if people, and it's a very Mr. Rogers, like look for the helpers, but I think look for the helpers and be a helper. And I think you will be very, very surprised and delighted with how much like kindness and opportunity and good things come your way.
Excellent answer.
Yes.
All right,
love
Kate
it.
Hanniford, everyone, the best lawyer I've met and the best cyber lawyer also. So there we go. Until then, Dustin,
guys.
introduce her to our favorite send-off.
That's right. And Kate, you kind of hit on this. So, counselor, you can tell me if I'm allowed to create this word. Our sign off is keep on cybering because we don't have a better one. Okay, good. This has been lawyer approved. Excellent.
There we go. All right, till next week, everyone. Keep on cybering.